I guess I want to start, John, by posing this question to you. You're a lawyer. You're based in D.C. You spend most of your time putting bad guys away, going after them and protecting the country. Yet here you are. You're in Arizona. You're at a corporate conference. I know you were at a couple other conferences recently. So I guess my first question is, what's a nice lawyer like you doing in a place like this?
Well, it is an unusual environment for us. So the National Security Division was the first new litigating division created at the Department of Justice in about 50 years. And we were created as one of the reforms after 9/11. And the idea was simple, that because a wall had existed between those who are on the law enforcement side on the one hand and the intelligence side on the other, that was one of the reasons why the September 11th attacks had occurred and so many individuals had lost their lives. So we were created in part to make sure that the wall came down not just legally, but culturally, so that our prosecutors and our intelligence lawyers were sitting side by side along with the lawyers that give advice to all of the rest of the intelligence community and the military, and that we'd focused on national security in a data-based way. And what I mean by that is we would look at the intelligence, what the community was collecting, and what it showed about what the threat was. What are the terrorists trying to do next? What are the groups doing? Where are they vulnerable to disruption? And then by having the intelligence drive our understanding of the threat, that would then drive where we took action. Success was not a successful prosecution of a terrorist attack after it occurred, but it was figuring out how to prevent it in the first instance. When I was over at FBI, and we were looking at what the intelligence was showing us about the cyber threat, we got much better at mapping the threat. And what we saw in terms of the data was horrifying. On a screen like the size of the one behind us, the data was showing day in, day out, a determined adversary was attacking every U.S. company pretty much across the board in every sector. And we would watch the intruders go in. We'd watch them hop maybe through a university into a company. We'd watch them inside the company. And then you would watch the data exfiltrate out. And I was listening closely to Dr. Pinker. And we're here, and the reason why I'm outside where I usually work, I work in a facility where you need a biometric screen to get in. Our walls have devices to keep anyone from listening. We do not see a lot of sunlight. I guess that's in common here. But the reason why I'm outside of that secure facility is when it came to cyber, we have a fundamental problem with the better angels of our nature. And one of the things Dr. Pinker said was one of the reasons why we see a decline in certain types of bad behavior, violent behavior, and he put that up earlier, I noticed, is because it was cheaper to buy than to steal. Not true in cyber, not yet. And so one of the things we did was we restructured the Justice Department to try to approach it like we do terrorism events, which meant retraining all hundreds and hundreds of prosecutors across the field on how to handle both the bits and the bytes and the specific statutes in cyber on the one hand, but also to get read into that intelligence side of the house, to break down the wall that had existed. And at the same time, the FBI issued an edict that said, thou shalt share what had formerly only been classified or sensitive. But what we didn't do yet is we realized it's not sufficient to share between law enforcement and intelligence when you're tackling this threat. We also need to reach out to the private sector where the developments are occurring in this space, where the critical infrastructure sits, and have a conversation together about how to appeal to the better angels of our nature.
Great. Well, let's talk about cyber. So the Sony attack. So you were deeply involved in figuring that out and tracking down the North Koreans and all that. Why don't you explain what happened, how you got involved in it, and what lessons that it might have for all of us?
So as we were rushing to change the way we approach the threat, to make sure that it is not cheaper to steal than to buy, one of the first cases that we brought was a case against 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, Unit 61398, for stealing across a range of American industry, from nuclear to solar to steel, from labor side to management side. And what we did is we tried to bring out into the light what we were seeing. And again, to one of Dr. Pinker's point, I think when it comes to cyber, we invested trillions of dollars, the best minds, and in about 30-some years, we transferred everything that we value, pretty much. According to one study, 98% used to be in analog space. Now 97% of that is in digital space. But we didn't imagine what the risks would be to having moved our society that rapidly to digital space. And so we didn't invest on the security side, and we didn't apply traditional models of deterrence. And so we saw threats, destructive threats, coming over the horizon. I'll tell you what we did not predict when it came to Sony was that the first major destructive attack by a rogue nuclear-armed nation was going to be over a movie about pot smoking. It's from Sony, and I had the unenviable task. High art. Yeah. And I was just on a panel with the CEO of Sony. We were together talking about attack, Michael Linton. So I will not comment on the movie, other than say he was a great partner at responding once they were attacked. But we had to walk into the Situation Room and brief the president, and it wasn't your normal briefing because we had to start by explaining what the heck that movie was about. One of the worst offenders, the North Koreans, is we all had to see that. We all saw the movie. It was a great movie. It was a great movie. No comment on the movie. But, so when the company was attacked, we get a call from Sony, and what Sony did right, encouraging for those of you in the field, is they immediately contacted law enforcement. I used to, Dr. Pinker was putting me out of business from my early career because I started prosecuting homicides, rapes, and then did child abuse and domestic violence cases. And similar to early domestic violence cases, there's a culture when it came to cyber of blaming the victim. And so that the victims don't come forward, and we have to change that culture. And it was true with Sony. So Sony gets hacked by North Korea, and until we realized that it was North Korea, the whole narrative, public narrative, was what did Sony do wrong? They must have done something wrong because they were hacked. Whereas those of you in the field know there's no wall you can build high enough or deep enough to keep a dedicated nation state out of an internet-connected system right now. That's true for government, as we've seen, and it's true for the private sector. What they did right is as soon as they were hacked, they contacted us in the FBI. We were able to work together, and because we were able to work together, we were able in 27 days to figure out who did it, North Korea. And in PLA, you'd seen us try out for the first time a new approach in this space, which was, one, you got to figure out who did it, be able to do the investigation and attribution. Two, when you figure out who did it, you can't be afraid of saying it publicly. We have to take it out of the shadows so people understand what the risks are and that there are consequences. And three, there have to be consequences. Because Sony cooperated, for instance, we were able to use the profilers at the FBI for the first time. These are the guys that do the serial murderers and serial rapists. And here, for one of the first times, we used a cyber profiler on Sony. And so in addition to our analysis of the actual code as part of attributing it to the North Koreans, the behavioral profiler from the behavioral analyst unit looked at their tradecraft, things like the use of a splash screen and what was on the splash screen. And just like in a murder, when you have a homicide, you go see the crime scene. And sometimes you'll see that a crime scene is staged. In other words, it's presented in a manner that's designed to have an impact on the witnesses who come in to the room. And the use of a splash screen here, putting a skull up in the Sony attack, is cyber staging. It's not necessary to do the destructive malware that they wanted to do. And by looking at how they had staged other crime scenes, the North Koreans, that's partly what allowed us to conclude so quickly with such high confidence that it was North Korea. We can't do that type of thing without working very, very closely with the victim on how it's in their system and sharing data. And as soon as we were able to say it was North Korea, it was an instance where I popped out of my basement to go on CNN, Wolf Blitzer, and other avenues to say that Sony did the right thing and that the bad guy here is North Korea. And as soon as we said it was North Korea, the narrative changed and became not what did Sony do wrong, but government. What are you doing to protect our companies and our people from rogue nation states?
Right. Well, that's a great segue to the next question. So, what is the government doing? So, if you're talking about state actors, right? You said that there's no way you can prevent a dedicated sort of rogue state from doing this, and then you think about you mentioned the prosecuting some of the PLA folks for for cyber attacks, but is law enforcement really an effective way to deal with this problem? I mean, if you look at the recent sort of cyber deal that we kind of did with China, even there, it basically only covers sort of cyber attacks for espionage or for commercial espionage purposes. National security, have at it. So how can we be comfortable that sort of law enforcement approaches can protect us on this?
It's a great question. And for too long, we took the criminal justice system off the table entirely and treated it as an intel problem. And one of the flaws to that is the norms question. If you can't appeal to the better angels, you can't change the behavior, especially theft. They're stealing intellectual property for commercial use. That's a cost-benefit analysis. And while we were treating it only as an intel problem and secretly watching it in secured facilities, and companies were ashamed to admit that it had occurred to them, so there's no public conversation about it, and going to the problem with the media sometimes, they had trouble visualizing it, so we had a crisis of imagination. In fact, I met the guy, and you will remember this now whenever you see TV. He, every time they do a cyber attack, you see these fingers on a keyboard, because they were trying to, well, I met the 20 years ago, the guy used to be at CNN, now he's at ABC. It's his fingers on the keyboard, and they use that same B-roll each time because they can't figure out how to visualize the cyber consequence. So we had to bring law enforcement onto the table to make clear that it is a violation of a norm, and that when it comes to the theft of intellectual property, that it's theft, not somehow culturally acceptable. I think we made significant progress with that with President Xi, where for the first time, in part because of that criminal case, but also because we were going to use the same all-tools approach that we use against terrorism. When we fight terrorism, we don't use just the criminal system. We use the Treasury Department to sanction certain actors. We use Commerce Department to designate certain entities that can't do business. We use military and diplomatic problem, feeding from what the intelligence shows the threat is. We need to start doing that in cyber and have deterrence be a part of the answer. And there's three types of attacks, right? One is destructive. We have to be able to show quickly that we can figure out who did it on a destructive attack. Otherwise, deterrence won't work because if you think it's anonymous, there won't be a cost, and so you're going to see nation states engage in behavior they wouldn't engage in any other space. The second was theft. We need to have a norm that says it's not okay to target somebody's company and steal what you would otherwise buy. The third, more complicated issue, I think, is traditional intelligence or espionage. And there we have to look at what we think is on the outer boundaries. And also, at the C-suite level, talking to you, having the technologists start thinking about, okay, the current internet, a dedicated nation state can get in to any internet-connected system if you give with enough time and resources. So how do we mitigate the risk once they're inside the system? You know, one thing, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, one issue that often came up with law firms, so my field is, law firms take the most damaging information about their clients as they possibly can and compile it all into a folder. And they would usually call that folder, Crown Jewels or some equivalent name inside their system.
Right.
If you assume a bad guy who wants to can get into your system, bad idea to put what you value most in a folder called Crown Jewels.
Got it.
Right?
Got it.
So you need
Fair
to start
enough.
thinking risk mitigation.
Got it. Well, I want to make sure we cover the terrorism topic.
Yep.
So let's pivot to that. So obviously, it's become clear that bad people, terrorists, using the internet for their various nefarious means. But at the same time, we've got sort of the world, especially the tech industry, still reeling from sort of the Snowden disclosures and the backlash that caused and so forth, where most people thought that the U.S. government at least was guilty of substantial overreach. Now we've had resulting debates that's sort of come up around encryption, around the use of social media by terrorist groups, and oftentimes those debates have not been particularly constructive. So I guess I want to cover those two topics, but do you think it's possible for us to have reasonable debates about this? You hear folks in government saying that tech companies are aiding and abetting terrorists, and sometimes you hear tech companies saying very not so nice things about the government. Do you think it's possible to have a reasonable conversation about this?
Oh, I absolutely think it's possible, and it's why we need to get out to forums like this, answer questions, and have discussion. Let me start a little bit with seeing what we're seeing as what the threat is and why it's different. Sure. And it comes in different forms. So one way the threat is different is when I was working on these issues, and it was core Al-Qaeda. Core Al-Qaeda had a strategy of trying to conduct large-scale spectacular attacks. They still are. And they would control their brand very carefully, and they would vet individuals before they would allow them into a plot. It usually involved travel overseas into the Fatah, the region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, that was largely ungoverned. And we became much better at disrupting that type of attack, and it had a lot of avenues in which you could disrupt it because of the time that it took to plot and plan that large-scale spectacular attack. They're still trying that approach. So is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and an offshoot called al-Nusra. But more recently, you've seen the Islamic State in the Levant, or ISIL, try a new strategy. And what they are doing is essentially they're trying to crowdsource terrorism. And so they blast propaganda using American-made and built products, social media products, out into the ethersphere. And the vast majority of that propaganda, even though it's very slickly produced, does not fall onto individuals who are willing to go down that radicalization path. But it only takes a small number to commit terrorist attacks. And so what we're seeing is that this strategy has been effective. They're using our social media, our tools that do so much good and have caused so much innovation, but they're using those same services that are provided to them for free to reach into the United States. And we're seeing in the types of cases that we have a huge increase. So we've done about 75 terrorist cases over the last year and a half or 2 years that are either individuals who have fallen prey to that message and want to go abroad to commit unspeakable atrocities that include enslaving women as a political tool, raping women as a political tool, indiscriminately killing Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And we have a responsibility not just to protect the United States from individuals who might go and come back with those skills, but we have a responsibility, as the United Nations adopted unanimously last year in UN Resolution 2178, to keep our citizens from conducting those types of attacks overseas. But we're also seeing, when we became more difficult to travel, ISIL put out a message that said, okay, attack where you live. Don't try to travel, no passport, no travel required. Kill in your neighborhoods, find local military, find police, and cause damage. That's worked. We have about 15 cases now this year. We had none last year of individuals who get radicalized on that message. They get the general message, and then they end up talking directly to the terrorist overseas using a US-made and built product to walk them down that path of radicalization. This was not true when we were facing Al-Qaeda. It used to have to take place somewhere in the community or person-to-person communication, so it's new. And if we are going to disrupt that, we also need to look at not just the social media, but the age. What we're seeing is in over 55% of our cases, the demographic inside the United States is 25 or under, and in 1/3, it's 21 or under. And I'll be the first to tell you, the federal justice system, criminally prosecuting juveniles is a failure. I mean, we have to do it if we're unable to otherwise prevent the attack, but that is a long-term failure. We need to find another way to reach that audience and keep them from getting radicalized.
So 2 questions then. Given that threat, encryption, the first question. So end-to-end encryption seems like a pretty logical thing for communications tech companies to do in the wake of what came out with the Snowden disclosures. So what do you think that companies should do differently, and why?
So I'll start with, encryption is good. And so I couldn't do my job and worry about the cybersecurity threat without encouraging people to think of encryption on their risk mitigation scale. So part of the debate we're having now is knowing that terrorists, along with those who exploit children, are using some of the services that Google, that Twitter, that Facebook provide, and the vast majority of users use it for good. Knowing that they're exploiting it, a couple of things. One, what the FBI director was asking for is in instances where we're able to meet the factual predicate. In other words, you get probable cause, there's a specific terrorist located overseas, we know they're communicating with a specific child or young adult inside the United States, we're able to get the court order. We serve the predicated individualized court order on the company. What we're finding now is with some tools or services, the company says, we're unable to it's legal, but we can't effectuate, we're technically incapable of doing it. So that's a question where, going back to the Better Angels, this has to be an area where I think we innovate our way out. And I find it hard to believe that we can't, given how much we're just hearing some very optimistic services of things we can't even imagine now being in place 5 years from now, that knowing that this is the way that they're abusing these systems, there isn't a way to be able to respond. And the second is cybersecurity, which is another area where we're calling on individuals to innovate, which would be, I just had a case now, it broke this week. We've talked about terrorists very much have announced their intention to use cyber-enabled means to cause as devastating attack as they can. They announced that with weapons of mass destruction. We're doing everything we can to keep them out of their hands. Al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, said, I want to cause a devastating cyber attack. AQAP and ISIL have echoed that call. So we know they have the intent, and we're trying now to desperately race to keep them from having the capability, or when they develop that capability, to make sure that companies here have developed the resiliency, particularly in critical infrastructure, that you're